Shall we begin? Let's begin now.
I have a question.
Oh, well, here, let's do your question first.
Yeah, no,
Let me
I
get-
was just thinking about the tree and the worlds, and I was thinking about what we had said about the colors, that the complementary colors and everything, and that is in Briah. And why is those colors placed in Briah that correspond so good to the color wheel? That was my question.
Oh, that's a great question. So you see, I pulled our pictures up because I was anticipating this. So the question then is, this is actually the tree as presented in Briah, which we learn from authors like Dion Fortune, Mystical Qabalah. At the front end, when she goes through each of the different things, she gives you the breakdown at the front end of each sphere, each Sephiroth. She gives you the breakdown and tells you what color it is within which world and which god name or angelic name or what have you is in use. When she's doing that, she's looking at this diagram right here, and she's describing that with this understanding, the up, down, in, out understanding. So to go higher on the tree is to go within, to go towards the center, which, and it's important to realize that whenever we discuss the tree, we lack the third dimension, that there's something more. This is just a shadow of the truth. It's 2 dimensions out of 3 in a description of a fuller process. So I believe the reason why, and then in answer to your question, so then the second world, as we discussed, would be Briah, which would be the second ring instead of the inner ring. And why are we not describing everything from the aspect of absolute instead of beginning with Briah? I believe because it is incomprehensible to us to understand the archetypal world in full without a complete translation of your being, which means you pass through Da'at, and in that passage, you're like Enoch. You are with God, you walk with God, and then you are no more, because you become part of that archetypal process. Everything that relates to us as beings, created beings, rests within the chalice, within this lower realm. And the first manifestation then would be in Briah. So just like children, we're taught the primary colors. And we're taught that, okay, these are the 3 primary colors, and they are the purest form. You can't reduce a color any more than what you have there. So they represent the purest emanation. And then their combinations result in the secondary colors of Yetzirah, and that's why we call it the formative world, because we're going from an act of creation, which is the union of those 2 colors, into the formation of something greater, which then distills into Asaya, into the material world where we live. So I think that what we're taught then, when we look at that, is we're looking at this, and from our understanding, go back this way, from our understanding, we're functioning from this, but we exist in this. It is all these things all the time, but the process of them existing in these concentric reductive spheres is actually a description of this. So we're working through the tree within the active world of Asaya, the material world. And when we get all the way up to what we believe is Keter, through releasing and reducing ourselves, because as we move up the tree, in order for us to achieve enlightenment, which is moving into Keter, right? In order for us to achieve that, we must let go of things that we were to ascend. This is why in every philosophy, the material body is villainized. It's the anchor that holds us down. It's complete with all kinds of sensations that require our cognition, our attention, that pull us away from what we want or believe we want to do in other directions. So in order for us to move up, in order for us to move up the tree, you visualize yourself as in the tertiary world of Asaya down here, and then you're moving up through the tree, your choice, which path you wish to take. But you become one of these secondary colors, which means that something has been let go of. You've reduced yourself to a degree. And as we move ourselves up into the primary colors of Briah, we have to let go of yet another thing. I think that this is probably the most significant transition, because when you go from Yetzirah to Briah, the combination of two Briah colors creates a secondary color within Yetzirah and reveals its complementary color, its opposite, within Briah. Okay? So if I combined Geburah and Tipperet together, I get the orange of Hod. And its complementary opposite is that which is, it's an opposition. It is what it is not. So as orange, it doesn't incorporate any blue. So that is its complementary opposite. Similarly, if I'm talking about Netzek, it results from the union of Chesed and Tipperet. So that gives me the green. So if I'm ascending and I'm working my way up, I have to make a decision. And the decision is, what am I going to let go of? If I'm working my way up and I decide I would like to progress and continue up the pillar of severity, to do that, that means I must let go of mildness. I must let go of Tipperet. It's no longer part of me. I'm casting it off and polarizing myself so that I can ascend into Geburah. Similarly, I would do the same thing if I want to set aside mildness and work up the pathway of the pillar of light and work myself into Chesed. As an alchemist, what we do is we cast aside the extremes. So to be the gold in the center of Tipperet, that means I have to let go of my tendencies for destruction that exist within Geburah. And I also have to let go of the tendencies towards too much mercy, right? The vice of mercy is, you give too much, it causes indolence and periods of just decay. There's some sweet spot in between, right? So I let go of the one to become that middle pillar that is in fact always the staff of power. That is your direct route. By doing that, what you've done is you're imitating what is taking place in an archetypal realm, because that's why the Father is the Son. So the Father of Keter is revealed in the Son, in that it doesn't polarize to either, it is both, then divided by its will into three components. And like I said, for us to get into this, that upper realm, it really breaks the brain a little bit, because it requires the conversion of our reality into a world without color, a world that exists where there's grades of polarization, and that those grades are infinite, because you'll never achieve the infinite darkness or infinite light we ultimately, as a created being, will be within that spot anyway. I think this is why Chokmah winds up working itself, and it transitions with Keter in terms of which sphere best represents the activity of the spheres that descend beneath it. So the white of Keter then it descends into Chesed. The gray of Chokmah would descend into the sun. That gray carries with it the principle of rhythm, right? Because it's that the gray is the result of the flow back and forth, force and counterforce being met within Chokmah as the representation of all force. And then that force then distilling into the presence of rhythm that is seen within both Tiferet and Yesod, different degrees of rhythm, but still expressions of that oscillation. If it begins, it must end. If it rises, it must fall. If it lives, it must also die. You know, and vice versa. If it dies, it must also live, which is where the concept of reincarnation comes, because it understands that middle pillar. But I think the reason we do this is because this gives us a really clear distillation of the process that then would lead us into Absolute. By grasping this, as we work ourselves down and we use a system like this, which is far more intricate, this system then walks us through the meditations that are necessary, and the color scheme alerts us as to the presence of ourselves within a different environment. If you are expecting Netzik and you're seeing lots of saffron, you know that you're not in Netzik. You know, you're probably somewhere else. Could be Hod, could be Gabora. It depends on the grade of the color. You know, and that would make the mind aware in those moments of projection. And those moments of projection exist as we extend ourselves up through the tree and out into the area beyond the Keter that we understand. We move out of pentacles and we move into swords, and then from there into cups. And I really think that the idea of cups, it gives you the truest expression of our overall state, which is a state of passage. Everything must pass through water in one way or another, childbirth to everything else. And as a result of that passage, we come into being. So in the archetypal world, the way to describe the archetypal world, if I were to say it, would be that I will be in Keter, I am becoming in Chokmah, and I am in Binah. So then that gives you the higher self, the middle self, and the subjective self. And what's really cool is if you take an equilateral triangle, and I have a video where I did this a while back with the Eye of Horus, and then you divide it in half, and then divide it in half, and divide that in half, it will create a little inner flame or an eye as you follow each point of intersection into the halves. So it is the I, it is the self, it is the point of emanation through which the correspondence of the other principles then become manifest within gross reality of chesed as vibration. That's the result of all this going on, and then we have vibration. Things become. So, a good question. Hey, Marty, or Horace. Hey, Horace.
Hey.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good. So what was the original question about pathworking?
No, the question, yes, go you.
Oh, the question was, why are we shown this? As this is the starting point in almost every manual for understanding Qabalah as a beginner, instead of being presented with something like this right away. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because by understanding this, we understand the essential essence of what we are experiencing. And it gives us a key towards pathworking and ascension. Mm-hmm. This also works like that, but it's the next level. and often this is something that is conducted within fraternal orders. So, and each of these colors then could be seen on one's robe or sash as an indication of where one is working currently. Not necessarily their station, but where they're working. So that if you're working with an accolade, and they might have, that nice emerald green that we're familiar with for Netzik, you could understand where they're communicating to us non-verbally. This is my place. This is where I'm working from to go somewhere else, and you stay in those stations until you have a degree of mastery, and then you work somewhere else.
So does that kind of work both ways? Both using the tree as a map of where your consciousness is. So if you are somewhere, if your consciousness is in some state at any moment, you can use the tree to orient yourself, because at a really basic level, you may be seeing these types of colors. And then you go into the tarot. If you're on a path or in a sephira, there are things you can understand, so you can orient yourself. But then can you also go the other way? Like, I want to work in Qabalah, so I put on a red cloak or something. Doing things like that, applying the symbols and colors of where you want to go, also kind of help take you there? Absolutely.
Absolutely. You've just touched on the reason why robes exist, why in martial arts certain belts exist, and the progressive order. It communicates to you, but it also is part of your vibration. If you're a black belt, then the world understands you've undergone certain rigors that your community expects of someone who's obtained true mastery, hence the belt. And as you're working your way up, this is an indication of your striving towards mastery, right? And it's always the context. So for me, the tree is a glyph that describes many things, but among them is self-mastery. It's the greatest key is to understand oneself by meditatively placing oneself within a certain environment and allowing that to exist within you. Realizing that while we're looking at this, we're actually working here in Asaya, the active world. That there's a bridge that must be crossed, and that bridge, the first toll keeper is, well, there's 3 ways to gain entry. And the entry into this world, you can gain entry through the unconscious mind, which is experienced in Yesid, which is the foundation for conscious action and behavior, as we know for sure through the studies of the 20th century. We absolutely know it. Marketing firms rely on that knowledge, that the unconscious foundation of a human being can drive them into the creative realm in a particular direction. So yes, it is that. The language and symbolism can move you into Hod. It is something which is seen but also experienced as a codification of reality. This is an inherited byproduct that is seen as a descent from Qabalah. Hence, the orange of Hod is where one is able to use the power of the chariot as a means of polarizing. And the polarization is the greatest form of polarization in language that we know of today is basic, the 1 and 0 digital language, which essentially is it this? 0. No. Is it that? 1. Yes. Is it this? 0. And it just describes any number of things, from colors to documents. It's all built on the same idea of yes and no, which is straight up Hod, pillar of severity, right? because you're doing that polarization language. On the other end, within Netzik, you're looking at causative reality, or the implication of causative reality, because of the emanation. It's the inheritor of vibration. That vibratory capacity plus rhythm gives you cause and effect. The way a thing is, plus the way a thing is with an environment as it opens and closes, gives you a description of the cause and effect, which is seen and experienced in Netzik. So by moving into each of those, and that is seen as something that is experienced within, it's an emotional vibration, where Hod is an intellectual vibration that appeals to the mind, and that's its inheritance from its union with Tipperet. Netzik experiences the other side of mind, not the intellectual mind, but the emotional mind, which is stimulated through vibration, not polarization. It's that part of the mind walks into a room and says, this place has a good vibe. They're kind of standing in Netzik in my mind at that point, because they're not using analytical words like Hod would use to describe it, they're just feeling it. And that's the inheritance of the vibratory conduct that is seen in Chesed. So, yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting.
So what's the difference between emotions in terms of Netzach and emotions in terms of Briah?
Oh, okay, going all the way up to the top.
Right, because we think of water emotions,
yeah,
and that whole world is essentially emotional. But it seems like maybe it's because when we talk about emotions as a personal experience, then this is more Netzach. Maybe I answered my own question.
Yeah, because in the archetypal world, feelings and emotions can't be described on human terms. Activities can't be measured by what we quantify as our experience because of the way it is displayed there. Everything is essentially in some form of activity at that point, whether it is active resistance or counterforce, as seen in Briah, or Binah, I mean, or the positive force that is seen emanating as a result of Chokmah, which to me is coaxial. So just as the force emanates, counterforce is doing the same thing. And in that braid, that bridge work that exists in the between is where all things happen. They become. So, which really, if you look at our lives, that's all we ever are. We never are anything, not from morning to night. We become constantly. We're constantly aging and renewing. There's nothing about any of us here that is the same as what we were when we were 3. We're not even close to the same. We're constantly becoming. And so we go from becoming a child instead of an infant to a teen, to an adult, to a middle-aged person, to an older person, and then we're done. It's never static. And that's how you know where you are. The predominant force in your life is the principle of rhythm more than any other. The others structure the rhythm. Polarity and vibration provide structure and nuance, the idea of the gender and Hod and the cause and effect within Netzik provides you additional mechanisms that we then experience here at the bottom in Asaya. But as we work up, things will work differently. Things will operate differently when we translate from the Keter of Asaya into the Keter of Yetzirah. That will be an entirely different experience. And so the way to quantify that experience, it's been done this way, so that as you're moving inward. So Asaya is your material world. The same principles exist. The Kabbalion teaches us that you have mastery over everything that is yourself and everything beneath you. And as you ascend, of course, that redefines what you are. But to move upward, it's strange. Ultimately, you must achieve a higher energetic state of being. That doesn't mean you're running around all the time. It means that your internal state of being is ramped up. The vibratory essence of it is moving upward, elevating you upward. I think the good news is that you know, as you move through the unconscious mind that exists here in Yesod, you get to understand that the complementary opposite to that is Tiferet. So your course is not actually moving through anything else but ascending. By understanding who you are on an unconscious level, understanding what drives you, and that only can be done through conscious effort, where you're like, okay, why did I just lose my mind here and get upset? Because I like touching on anger. It's a valuable emotion because it teaches you what's important to you. It immediately reveals your face and lets you know exactly where your priorities are, because you are letting loose this beast monster and feeling entitled at the same time that you have a right to do so. So anger is revelatory. Anger is seated in Yesod. It's that point, because it's almost always an unconscious thing that catches you unaware, especially if you're living like an active life where you're thinking about things a lot. And that's why I use my anger as a tool to go, oh, well, I got to work on that. Clearly, that's a hot button. Until you get unoffendable. And then you're just like, okay, I get it. So. We had a question. Oh, did I answer everyone's question?
I think so. I have one about anger, because is it the difference between the anger in Yesod and the power of anger in Geburah?
Yes. Okay, I see where you're going. So in Geburah, anger acts as a destructive force.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
No question about it. It's scorched earth. If you're driving your anger from Geburah, you want scorched earth. Like, that's where that's coming from. It's all about the biblical eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, pound of flesh for a pound of flesh. And so you're all Old Testament there. The newer, in a more New Testament-y way, you would vibrate higher, turn the other cheek, and reside in Chesed. No matter what, when you realize the principle of rhythm resides within Tiferet, that idea is what goes around comes around, or in a biblical way, vengeance is mine. So you're not the divinity that resides there. You can be there because you are powered by that. But the act of being vengeful does not exist within Tiferet as a human being, right? That belongs to a greater context. So in this idea, then, the word to forgive makes sense, because it's a recognition beforehand that something is given. This is not mercy necessarily. Mercy is obtained here in Chesed. That's why it's called mercy. It's because mercy is a position where you're overpowered. You are in a place where no matter what, no one can tell you what to do or enforce any will upon you. So then you are the actor of will. Your vibration defines everything that proceeds from you. So you are merciful. The greatest example of that is in parenting. You have a small child in front of you who's making you lose your mind. And it is you who must then vibrate higher, step away from the impulse drive of going into Geburah, and allow yourself to move towards something. In understanding why they're doing it, you'd sit in Netzik as cause and effect. You'd be looking at them and going, why are you upset? Why are you making me a crazy person? this is where love begins, right? So if you want to just truly love them as they are, then you step into Tipperet. That's the pillar of mildness. So it's not overly too much energy. It's not frustration. It's the iron rod that is spoken of in Proverbs. This is that rod. So if you spare that rod, you spoil the child. So if you give too much kindness and mercy, then you become, this is an Old Testament reference, but it's in the book of Samuel where the high priest has two sons who really blow. They suck really bad, and he keeps forgiving them. And as a result of that, instead of disciplining them, and as a result, they wind up becoming very decadent and ruining things. So the rod is spoiled. It doesn't mean that you're vengeful, you're beating. That belongs to a higher source. You cast aside that over mercy, and you cast aside the need for destruction, and become the mild one in between, and recognize that yes, they may be this way now, but they won't be this way forever. You know, so parenting advice from a grandpa here. But it's in the tree. It literally is like there. The idea is you're ascending your consciousness. And I'm using the parent idea because you have all power as a parent. You always do. So it's the closest thing to being the divinity of the home, because your vibration sets everything in motion, absolutely everything. So, yep. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
So Cameron says, hi, Aubrey. Hope your daughter is still doing well after the accident. She is. Thank you very much for asking. Here's my question for today. Over the past few weeks, the word communication has been popping up everywhere for me. There are a number of ways to communicate, and when you break the word down, it feels pretty straightforward. Of course, in reality, things can become complicated quickly, with or without our intent. In short, communication simply breaks down, unintended. So, relating it to a protagonist with a limited understanding of their environment, how would they be able to limit the problem themselves of bad communication before it reaches a climax, like a divorce? Also, how significant is the word communion when paired with communication? Thanks. Good question. This is a great question. Let's close that. So this is what I'm thinking. The relationship between the word communication and communion is essential to understand that. When you communicate, we often are standing in Hode. Pop that back up. So when we communicate, we often are sitting here over here in Hode, because this is where we're using language. That's where language exists. And we're taking an abstract idea, perhaps something we feel, like in Netzek or in Yesed, right, that we don't understand about our feelings, but it's something deep. And we try to quantify that, bring it into formation. This process means that the person across from you is also decoding what you're saying. And our assumption is that they are hearing the words that are coming out of our mouth. and instead of actually filtering what we're saying, anticipating what's about to happen, and then coming to a conclusion, perhaps even before you finished your sentence. And this happens a lot. People will anticipate what you may be saying. Perhaps that's because you're a really good communicator and it's undeniable that's the direction you're going. Or it could be because they're just kind of ego-driven and they just want to assert themselves. They'd rather answer than listen. The way to avoid this is just to know this, that this is a vulnerability of communication, because the ultimate goal is for the two minds to become one. When you consider how limited our words are, and yet the power that they can possess, it's a bit striking to me. There's a paradox there, that with just a few words, like saying an amber sunrise, can put an entire picture in your mind of a golden sun rising. And you'll even fill in for me where that's happening. It's this entire device that exists. It's because for us as human beings, I believe the communication is more than simply verbal and nonverbal. I believe that there is a communion that takes place, that as you become more familiar with the person, you're able to say less and mean more. I've experienced that with my wife. We've been married 36 years. You know, many times she'll get frustrated with me just because she'll give me a really limited amount of data, and then I just am piecing it all together rapidly to know, oh, you're talking about this thing that happened there at that time. But then I get the whole picture in my head. There is a communion of mind and mind. So communication is the act of establishing that communion. And we do it through multiple ways. But the way to prevent a miscommunication is to understand the vulnerabilities of communication, that people may misunderstand, that they may mishear you, that they may be thinking of something else as you're talking to them. This is where meta communication comes into play, where instead of, let's say someone says something and you think that's quite shocking, why would you say that? You can put the brakes on even the most heated conversation if you've got a grip and go, so what I'm hearing is that you're really mad at me when I do this thing. And it's amazing how satisfying that can be to the other person. Instead of just denying that they feel the way they feel, you can't. That's dehumanizing to sit there and pretend that someone's feelings are not valid. You may not understand those feelings, but they're valid. And they're absolutely as valid as your own feelings. They're another component of the universe that has experienced something that is unique to them. And so you can't afford to just assume that they're experiencing it exactly as you are. There's going to be differences. Just the whole thing, the encoding of how the brain is processing. So to me, it places you in a vibratory state of power by recognizing the limitation of what you're trying to do from moment to moment when you're communicating. Because it also means that you're allowing yourself to make a mistake, that you can make an error, that you may misspeak. You know, I misspoke, I'm sorry. The idea I actually meant to say was this, which can only happen if the other person, instead of blowing up and going, what? You said what? Goes, wait. So what I'm hearing is, it's amazing how that'll just put the brakes on. I've been in really, really tense situations where I wanted to very much just go at it. I could feel that in me. There's an instinct in us, you know. It's why biblically, when it's described, and it says the natural man is an enemy to God. We're talking about Tiferet here. The natural man is up here in Qabalah. The natural man resides under the pillar of severity. The natural man is destructive. I give you human history as my evidence. So the natural man is inherently destructive, and that is an enemy to all things, including yourself. So it stands in your own way. It's why when you ascend, if you wish your communication and your communion to move upwards, you have to set aside your desire to be right. Qabalah demands, because of polarization, a question to be answered. Who's right? I'm right, because I'm feeling it, I'm saying it. I'm sitting under this, in Bina, I'm sitting under the subjective self. I'm operating from that. A feeling that's inherited late, in Netzig, but truly, if it's destructive, if I need to be right, if I have to be the one who wins, then I'm an enemy to truth. I just am. You can't reside in a position where you're seeking illumination if you're determined to be right. Even if you are right, then it requires you to step back and go, I choose not to engage in that destructive line of feeling. There's one of my favorite scriptures from a long time ago. It's actually in the Book of Mormon, strangely enough, but it's the prophet Nephi, and he talks about how angry he is. And he says, why am I angry? Because of my enemy, because his brothers are really ticking him off. And through the course of this psalm, he sets aside the anger. He counts all the reasons why not to be angry. It's actually really beautiful. It's in 2 Nephi 4, and it begins in verse 16. Crazy how that stuff sits in your head forever. Haven't looked at it in years. But it begins there, and it works its way through. And he's basically accounting for all the reasons not to be angry, all the reasons to not be destructive, to not fall prey to the thing that's set in your chest, which is that destructive element. Because ultimately, as a communication requires that there is a definition to something. Most communications result from us not using the same defined term or agreeing that something means something, even though we're experiencing it the same way. We'll say, no, it doesn't mean that. And the other person says, yes, that's exactly what it means. And then we'll state evidence. It's all working on the pillar of severity. There's no pillar of mercy working at any time there's an argument. So, and it's inheritance, an upward inheritance of Gabora through down into Hod or downwards. But so my counsel to everyone is just that. Realize that there's a pairing process that happens when you communicate. And the first thing that is let go will be the need to be right. And instead, that should be replaced with the need to be accurate, to completely express what it is you're hearing and what it is you're feeling. But in terms that take responsibility for the feeling. Yes, when people yell at me, it makes me tense, but that's something that's just in me that happens when someone gets in your face. You know, if you realize that, it empowers you against the effect of that. You know, if they're going to raise their voice, you've already won the argument because now they've lost themselves in some kind of emotion and need for rightness. And you can address that. You can manage and mitigate that by understanding what their need actually is. That the desire for correctness might be some injustice was played as a result of your conduct, and it needs to be balanced. And if you can balance it, then you're sitting in Tiprit again and allowing that rhythmic flow to happen. It's when you're on the other side, you're grabbing it by the throat and the energy gets stuck. And then violence happens and you get a bar fight, you know, because they're all over on that side. So that's my answer to Cameron's question.
I could add a little bit to that.
Please do. Absolutely.
So this is something I've thought about, this specifically. It's something I've thought a lot about in the last, very long time, like 5, 6, 7 years, because I've dealt with this a lot, especially as someone who considers himself to be, an apt communicator in various capacities. And I've spent hours and hours and hours in conversations with nothing really happening. There's no progress in anything. But what's the nature of that? What are you trying to do in a conversation? And something I've said for a long time is that all communication is persuasive. And why is that? Well, and I've kind of gotten closer to describing what I mean by that and what I think is true. So all the spheres include the properties of the spheres above them.
Yeah.
So communication as a simple means of exchanging descriptions of information, trying to make it as plain as possible, like your zeros and ones, still includes the principles of polarity and vibration, because it has to, because Hode includes those.
Yes.
So what's actually happening is that communication is a means of conveying some polarization or some reconciliation of vibration. And when you
Oh,
when you
yes.
spend
Yeah. I like that.
yeah, it's a portal. Words, language is a portal to a vibration, and as two independent consciousnesses, communication is the process of reconciling the vibration to sufficient degrees to achieve some kind of unity in consciousness, which is really just a really fancy way of saying things that we encounter all day long. So ultimately, it's a long story short, the painful conclusion for me, as someone who has tried very hard through many modes of life, let's just say, to try to reconcile something as critical as an interpersonal relationship, in large part through communication. You can use communication to align yourself to another vibration, or to invite the person to align to your vibration. And if you can only control yourself, you can change your vibration to reconcile with the other person. But then there's this, I guess it's what they call cognitive dissonance, because you're inauthentic to your highest identity. And so what I find is that ultimately the only way to be is authentic to your highest form of vibration, and the rest will sort itself out. And the problem is that sometimes that's not what a part of you wants to have happen, because especially if you're going through a lot of personal growth, a lot of spiritual growth, your outer world is going to change dramatically as you let your vibration be as authentic as possible. Almost, there's nothing that's off limits that suddenly your outside world can change. Where you live, who you're associating with, what you're doing from day to family, philosophy, anything, and that can just be very disconcerting to the part of you that doesn't fully grasp the the higher harmony of it, the Tipperate of beingness. So I think I've made a point in there somewhere. I'm not sure.
Oh, you did. It's brilliant.
Okay.
I was just waiting for you because
Okay.
I wanted to hear more. Like it was brilliant. It really, what you're trying to create is a synchronicity, so that with communication, which is part of that persuasive, polarizing, you can often help a person. The idea of your vibration then in creating a polarization in Qabalah, this then is a dissolution of something. Someone is depressed, so you tell them something. You bring your vibration in and you communicate something to them that helps restore their happiness. You give them some good news. You compliment them. You brighten their day. So you have destroyed the depression. And in its place, you've created happiness. And it's this simultaneous process where the tools found in Hode then work up and through the tree, depending upon where it is needed. If someone is, under a great deal of stress, this would suggest to me that I would then create my vibration, work into Qabalah, so that I can talk about Yesod, what's really getting to you. So, and again, the thing that we always fear, at least to me, it's to be rejected. And that rejection is the other side of Binah. It's the other side of the feminine. It's to resist and to receive in the sacred feminine. So And when our ideas, our feelings, our intents, our emotions, they run into a surface that is unreceptive, then we feel the energy bounce back against us. And it causes a strange polarized emotional state where we then make a choice. I'm either going to be offended, or I'm going to be saddened, or I'm just going to ignore it. And because we've been denied, it's like that ball bouncing off a wall and coming back at you. And the energy has been absorbed in part by the wall, but it's still carrying with it the velocity of our intent. So an unrequited love, for instance, when if you state your affection for a person and it's met with, yeah, that's great. That energy that you've cast forth and the exposure of yourself creates a vulnerability that you are exposed to. You see yourself now for what you presented because it's being reflected back at you. And that can be devastating. That's the downside of communication. And realizing that all of us are walking into it with that fear at one level or another. That apprehension, because we're all old enough to have been misunderstood at least 100 times at this point, and we know what the consequence of misunderstanding is. Often the consequence is, you guys hear that? Often the consequence is something that leaves us in a state of feeling like you're out in the vacuum, right? Because there's no connectedness that goes on. So when we realize all of us are entering into that with fear of just being kind of discombobulated, and that know that the method of our communication is limited, it's requiring a kind of mental communion based on the selection of our words. When I walk into those situations, knowing that, it puts you in a vibratory state of power, where you have efficacy and authenticity. Now, to touch on what you said, Horace, about, for instance, when you downgrade your vibration to deal with someone, maybe communicate with them at that level, it's a condescension. That's literally what you're doing. You're condescending to someone. And if they catch you doing it, that's when you're in trouble, right? So the way to be able to be authentic while still doing that is to not think of them as different than yourself. That's the way, because we're all sitting here in the tree together, but we're down here, and most all of us never get out of this. From birth to death, they're here in the active world, unaware, they're just doing it. And that places them really subject to Yesod. And because the formation of all their thinking tends to be driven by the unconscious desires of their heart. So, and so that's, yeah. And that's where everyone is for the more part. What separates an alchemist or magician or a Kabbalist from the rest of that is awareness that these other states of being exist and that they're progressive. But keep in mind, just because they're stacked this way, the true, they're actually this right there. So imagine each one of these rings as just another tree stacked inward with the Keter at the border. And the translation of that into the next realm is the translation and progression of states of being. All the while shedding things away. It's why the other day when we were doing Tarot Tuesday, and we were talking about the elements, when we're talking about the elements, each one of these worlds represents a separate element. But when we're discussing the world as we experience it, we experience everything from Briah down through Asaya. We experience things exist as a solid, a liquid, or a gas. The moment fire is applied to it, it is broken into its essence. This is why the first process in alchemy is the nigredo. It changes what it was into something else. The ash that remains is not what it was in substance within the creative, formative, or material world. It is the essence of that substance. It's the groundwork of it, which then can be described only in terms, of absolute. But then as you work through the various processes, you wind up getting a distillation of that as well. But the idea is that our experience is here. And I guess this is going back to your original question. This is what we experience when we look around. Because the moment things burn, they're gone. They walk with God and are not, which is why biblically all the prophets like take off in a fiery chariot. You don't see them anymore, like Elijah, the prophet, fiery chariot. And because you can't be here anymore. You shed enough of this and you can't be here anymore. It's like that race of beings in Star Trek, the original series, that are energy, and they just put a planet together so the Enterprise and the Klingons could hang out with them, and they all look like farmers and shepherds, but they're actually pure energy just manifesting down here for our benefit. It's a great allegory for the enlightened beings basically doing this. They exist here, but they can step into our realm, into a saya, by crossing over their own da'at. So they leave their version of their archetypal realm in their descent to become the illuminated beings that then, the illuminated masters that you always hear about, that are remaining, like Bodhisattva Manchuri, who says, I will stay until all of humanity is incarnated for the last time. Make sure we all make it. I love that guy. So,
yeah, so I know it's not Tarot Tuesday, but I think this discussion has helped me decode the fours. And I think it makes perfect sense because, so something we're kind of describing, at least what I was trying to describe, is that kind of everything below the principle of vibration is illusion on that level. So communication is just, it's so limited that what you're really doing, the only thing real within the communication is the reconciliation of vibration. And so if the Four of Pentacles is earthly power, that makes sense because it's what I kind of just said was my ultimate conclusion. You have to be authentic to yourself and the whole world changes around you to reflect that. The Four of Cups would be, so Hesed in Briah, or no, Hesed in Hesed in Briah would be kind of the highest we can experience with what we think of as ourselves, and it's called pleasure, and I'm guessing that that's probably interchangeable with bliss, which is what is Buddhists and so forth are just talking about. You're meditating, the highest thing you can achieve is bliss, and you can stay there. I think they're talking about the highest Hesed you can get to as an individual, which places them on the pillar of mercy.
Yeah, I completely agree. No, this is great. This is so awesome. I'm just like, yeah, just keep going, Horace.
Yeah, and I have to
You're
think
doing
about.
great.
I have to think about Four of Swords, rest from strife, and the Four of Wands, perfected work. Those seem tricky, but I'm sure it would come to me. But it's all about how I've come to adopt the perspective that the principle of vibration is, it's not the highest, but it's like the key principle to having this life experience. Correspondence and mentalism are kind of like, they're absolute. Like there's no denying them. Vibration is the first principle where you really have something you can work with.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And yeah, I would say that it is the first principle through which all action then takes place. The initial impetus of all things that descend after it. So and I love the idea of through a vibration, just remember that if you're authentic to yourself, if you're in the wrong environment, that's going to be disruptive to both you and your environment, you know. So a Catholic priest walking into a rave at 2 a.m, probably not the right vibe for either of them, you know. On the other hand,
depending on the color of his robe, anyway.
Yeah, well, the robe would be fit in just fine, right? So maybe bad example. So, but you get me, you know. So if you're walking into a solemn event like a funeral, the last thing you want to do is be super exuberant and, you know, dancing around to your music and your super high vibe and wondering why everyone's all down and low, you know. I would say the principle of vibration is greatest in its existence above all others. The principle of rhythm is the ultimate equalizer. So it is the consequence of polarization and vibration. It is the description of the pendulum swing, then going back.
Yeah, what I love about the principle of rhythm is that you can count on it.
Yes,
I use it. Yeah. I use it when I'm, you know, when I when I feel like things are very down right now. I'm like, well, as down as they, like, why don't I make them more down? Because then I can look forward to how up they're gonna be later. So it's like you can count on it. There's, rhythm makes you the you know, eternal optimist, if you want to see it that way, because it will always swing back the other way.
Yeah, optimist or pessimist, they're sitting in juxtaposition to each other, because the guy that's looking off to the pillar of mercy, as he sees that pendulum swing up to the end, he's like, oh, I knew it wouldn't last, right? Because it's all happy on that side. And oh, sorry about my dogs. And then the other guy, you know, on the other side facing the other way, says, oh, look, it couldn't last this bad forever, you know, and then the swing's coming back towards him, towards the middle. So yeah, that's how I always see it, is because there are two parts of me that stand like that, back to back, looking at either side going, well, you know, and the guy in the middle, you know, is realizing that the balance is going to be there. Nothing bad will last forever. Can't be depressed forever. Having been someone who used to just have horrendous, you know, depression and anxiety. Using these as tools, it really gives you a toehold on actual reality. Like, you know, you know that there's a lot of things that exist for actual reason. They can be described using these tools. You know, that it's amazing how versatile the tree is, how many things can be described and applied to it, you know. So, thank you both for joining me today. This has been awesome.
Thank you. Yeah,
this was a good one.
Very interesting. Yes.
I think I might do this again next week.
Yeah.
So and just make it open to see how many more people participate. I'll give it a little bit more time, and I'll publish this so that we can all see how much fun we had.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. I'll talk to you guys later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.